Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. We'll wait just 1 or 2 more minutes. Thank you. Hey, I think it's 2 p.m. sharp Manila time, so I guess we can get started. So good afternoon, everyone, or morning, evening, wherever you're joining us from. And welcome to the Green Roads webinar series. Each session of this webinar series explores key themes from ADB's Green Roads Toolkit, which include decarbonization, climate resilience, water and biodiversity management, disaster risk reduction, construction materials, and inclusive growth. My name is Johanna Siljakus. I'm a consultant at the Asian Development Bank, the ADB, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today we will focus on the data to deal methodology and its application to the transport sector to turn transport data, modeling, and decarbonization strategies into bankable investments. So Data to Deal is an exciting tool that aims to facilitate low carbon development planning on a national level. It links scientific data with planning processes, aiming to facilitate the practical implementation of low carbon pathways through concrete investment strategies and project pipelines. So the recording of today's webinar will be uploaded on the Green Roads webinar series page on the ADB Knowledge Events website. So the link will be shared in the chat box. Therefore, you do not need to worry if you have missed any of our past webinars on this topic. And if we can have the next slide, please. So today we've got some fantastic speakers. I will be introducing them shortly. However, before we get started, let me go through some house rules, and then after that, we'll have opening remarks and a couple of presentations, finalizing with a Q&A session. But going through the house rules first, so please note that your microphones will be muted at all times unless you've been invited to speak. If you have any questions for our speakers, please send them through the Q&A box at any time. You can find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and you can write your questions there, and we'll take them at the end of the session during the Q&A, as many questions as possible. So now that our housekeeping is out of the way, we can have the next slide. Thank you. We're excited to hear about from our three speakers. So first, we'll have opening remarks from Alfie Alsop. Alfie is infrastructure advisor in the Research and Evidence Department at the UK Government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO. After Alfie, we'll then hear from Mark Howells, the Program Director of the Climate Compatible Growth Program, CCG, who will be introducing us to the Data to Deal approach and its methodology. And lastly, we'll hear from James Dixon, Senior Lecturer in Transport at the University of Strathclyde and the Transport co-lead of the CCG program, who will give us a deep dive into the Data to Deal methodology and how it can be applied to the transport sector. So ADB has had the chance to work with this excellent team already for a while. initially working on transport sector low carbon pathways modeling, which forms part of this data to deal methodology. So ADB will be piloting the data to deal approach more holistically, kind of as a whole during the upcoming year or so, with support by FCDO. Some examples of the ADB project on low carbon pathways that I just mentioned will be showcased today, and we plan to arrange another webinar when we have results from the more comprehensive piloting of this methodology for the transport sector in the region later on. Yes. So as I mentioned, today we'll hear more about what the data to deal tool is about, or the approach is about, how it can be useful for governments in supporting their low carbon planning processes, including the development of updated NDCs and long-term low emission development strategies, as well as for implementing those plans and strategies. However, without further ado, I'll stop the introductions, and I would like to invite Mr. Alfie Alsop to deliver his opening remarks. So over to you, Alfie.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and good morning, everyone. And thank you again to our hosts from the Asian Development Bank for the invitation to join this webinar. And thanks also to all who have joined this morning or this afternoon. So hello to everyone. So as Johanna said, I am Alfie Alsop. I work in the UK Government's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office within the Research and Evidence Department. I also serve as the program responsible owner for the Climate Compatible Growth, or CCG, research program. CCG has championed an emergent framework for the pipeline from high-level climate ambition to investment-ready clean infrastructure projects, which is what we're calling data to deal. CCG has launched several fantastic policy briefs at COP30 as well, which detail the 7 steps of the data to deal framework. I would encourage you all to check these out on CCG's website. Once I'm finished talking, I'll pop a link in the chat so folk are able to access those. And to date, this framework has seen quite good success in mobilizing climate finance. Primarily, to date, these have been in energy systems and in Latin America, and we're also seeing early uptake in Africa. We're now working with the Asian Development Bank and my colleagues on the call from CCG to understand how we can effectively contextualize this framework for clean transport projects and investment. We know that there's a significant gap between the climate finance currently mobilized for transport projects and the investment needs of the sector. A robust, well-evidenced project pipeline with inputs from across relevant government ministries and stakeholders is an absolute necessity, especially in a crowded landscape where investors have the liberty of keeping their risk appetites low. And openly sharing data to learn from each other and exchange on progress and best practice will benefit all of us. That's why we at the FCDO are keen to continue our work with partners, including at GIZ and the Asian Development Bank, supporting the Transport Data Commons initiative. Of course, as of 2 days ago, the UN Decade of Sustainable Transport has begun. Aligning with the decade, we're also proud to have launched a new research program, which we're calling Research for Infrastructure in Developing Economies, or RIDE, where the UK will work alongside partners from GIZ, the World Resources Institute, the UK-based Transport Research Laboratory, and the Canadian IDRC. We're looking forward to engaging with all partners on the shared agenda of the UN Decade, including through both CCG and RIDE, on the effective use of data and evidence for inclusive sustainable transport systems. I won't take up very much more of your time. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from both Mark and James on how open data and the data to deal framework can best benefit the sector. Thank you all again for joining.
Thank you so much, Alfie, and thanks so much for also for highlighting this important gap between access to finance and the needs of financing for ensuring low carbon development of transport and infrastructure, which is really the root cause, or that data to deal also aims to cover. So thank you for these words. Now let me hand over to Mark Cowles to introduce you to in a bit more detail to the data to deal methodology. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Johanna and Alfie, for the introduction. Just checking that you can see my screen. Okay, very good.
Yes, thank you,
Um,
Mark.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Howells. I'm an academic from Loughborough University and Imperial College, and it's a privilege to take you through a sort of introduction to data to deal. Um, I, I lead the Climate Compatible Growth Program. This is a partnership that consists of a set of leading universities in the UK, plus a number of really important partnerships with governments, international organizations, and universities across the world. We're funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and something that we're really interested in doing is working together to understand problems, co-create solutions, and then develop public goods that benefit everybody, so that we can uh, move 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 us quicker towards mobilizing the finance that we need to invest in lower carbon infrastructure that accelerates economic growth. Alfie mentioned a second ago that there's a big problem in this space, and I quite like to characterize it, and I'll use a story in a minute for why we think this is so. And the problem is that on the one hand we have you know a very big need to be able to mobilize finance to see the kind of transitions that we want. Yet countries often struggle to mobilize that finance for various reasons, which we'll go into in a minute. And it's the case that we have funds that have finance available, but struggle to deploy it in the infrastructure space in a way that would help make this future feasible. So we have these two problems that data to deal works to improve. As Alfie mentioned a second ago, it's the case that in the Latin American context, data to deal, focusing on energy and transport, has managed to mobilize large scale financing, and we're busy setting this up for scale deployment in different parts of the world. But in order to provide a little bit of context before James dives into some of the transport specific detail, I thought it would be worthwhile just relating a kind of story that is not atypical. So, for example, many of us have just come back from the COP, the big climate change meeting. There will be countries that will be going there, and they'll have a set of projects that they want to go out and look for financing for. Those can be transport projects, energy projects, land use projects, and so on. But it's the case that folk don't really know how much funding is potentially available. So they will go there in a relatively speculative manner. Because it's speculative, they'll not have created the sort of high level political buy-in that you would need to develop a whole of government approach. They will not necessarily have spent the time building up the parts of government that are required to be able to do these sort of applications for this type of funding sensibly. As a result, some of the modeling and analytics that have been done may not be whole of government modeling and analytics that result in the sort of approaches that would be needed to end up with projects and nationally determined contributions that fit with the development vision, that are fiscally feasible and financially viable. So we take an example. Country comes along and it has this big project where it would like to move a lot of its transport, reduce transport demand, and move a lot of its transport from gasoline and diesel, say, to electric vehicles. And to do that, it's thinking about investing in more hydropower and solar power in order to provide clean energy. Now, because the high level commitment hasn't necessarily been put in place, this might not be a whole of government approach. So when the energy ministry looks at this, it might sort of take a step back and say, well, this is great, but I'm not seeing too much in here about how we make sure that there's an appropriate reserve margin in order to keep a functioning energy system in place, or investment in the transmission system, or investment in charging infrastructure. And this is a big red flag to funders. Immediately, you may see a divergence between the Environment Ministry that's putting forward the NDCs and the Energy Ministry. The Transport Ministry might come along as well and sort of say, well, this is very interesting, but to make these kinds of transitions, there are things that we need to do with our transport fleet, including fleet ownership models. We also have to make sure that the charging infrastructure is put in the right kind of places so we can service the demands that we need properly. So again, another ministry that might not agree with the way that the details of this plan. Another red flag for funders. The finance ministry could look at this and it'll say, well, this is great, but you want to move away from gasoline, and we get 20% of our revenue by taxing gasoline. So the finance ministry also puts up a red flag. And as the finance ministry holds the relationships with the international finance institutions, typically, we have a problem. Now, the IFIs and funds might look at these NDCs and, of a number of potential projects that are there, the hydropower plants, the solar power plants, the transmission infrastructure, the charging systems, and the new fleet system models and so on. The only thing that they could see that perhaps fits around a business model that is not being pushed back by all of the ministries involved is the hydropower investments. And frankly speaking, those hydropower investments are things that could potentially happen in any case. So the result is that we have a lot of concessionary finance that's been raised to accelerate investment in low carbon infrastructure, which could be used for a lot of other things, gets crowded into the one project that could potentially fund itself. So what we've done is develop this data to deal process to tackle a lot of these issues. And I'm going to go through some of these steps in the next couple of slides. It's the case that we represent this not as a series of sequential steps, although it's helpful to think about them as sequential steps, just for just to think about the actions required. But these are things that happen at the same time. Another thing that's really important to bear in mind while we're putting this data to deal thing together, this is co-created. It's something that has been put together by over 30 international institutions, including the Asian Development Bank, and we're able to draw on the sort of wisdom and lessons learned from across this important, diverse set of actors, so that what we come up with and what people have as a reference is acceptable. So we'll go back to our story. First thing that we do is we'll work with governments using a tool called FinTrack to understand exactly how much finance is potentially available from concessionary funds and so on. You saw the numbers earlier on. These can be billions of dollars per country. And so it's the case that with a clear picture of what is potentially on the table, we can then go to leading ministries and establish the requirement for the ministries and so on to work together. The Costa Rica case study, for example, came out of the president's office, but with this high-level commitment, with a very clear target in mind with respect to the amount of funding that could be mobilized, it's the case that we can do an important set of next steps, including creating the mandates to work across different government institutions and stakeholders. The next piece is that for successful finance mobilization, this has to be developed and driven by government. Consultants, of course, can be used, but if this is driven by fly-in, fly-out consultants, it's the case that a lot of the information gets outdated quickly, and ownership is limited, which stifles the kind of things that need to be done a little bit downstream when it's the case that plans need to be updated and iterated. So next, we'll pull all of the ministries together. So instead of just the environment ministry in our story developing the NDCs and so on, it'll be the case that we're working together with the transport ministry, with the energy ministry, with the finance ministry, and think about the future that we want to make sure that the measures that are going to be put in these scenarios are things that fit. We then work together to make sure that the analytics are coherent and consistent. So it's the case that we build enough solar power, enough transmission, and we know how many buses or electric vehicles will be put into the fleet to be able to make these sorts of changes. And we do this collectively with the ministries involved. We then take it a step further and we'll think about what kind of policy reforms and other things are needed across institutions and what support is needed to get there. So in our example, it would be the case that we would be working with the Energy Ministry and Finance Ministry to think about how to do power purchase agreements with the solar farm, as well as wheeling charges for the transmission system. And then we'd be working with the Transport Ministry to think a little bit about how we would set up the models, the business models around the charging stations, and then the business models around the fleet and fleet ownership. And we'd work with the Finance Ministry, and we'd have a look at the fact that yes, you would be reducing your revenue, your tax revenue from gasoline consumption and tax on gasoline, but it's the case that you wouldn't be importing as much gasoline, so there'd be much more money retained within the economy, and that would move around the economy differently, which would give you the potential to tax different pieces of the economy. With that in mind, it's the case that what we get out of this then is not just a scenario that talks about what the future might look like, but it gets delineated into a set of very discrete projects that are financially viable, physically feasible, and they fit with overall development. Once we've got those projects out, we can then look at the funds that are available to mix and match them. So we optimize the funds. So instead of all of your funds getting crowded into the best project that you had before, um, which was the hydropower plant, we can put funds in and around the power purchase agreements for the solar system. We can put in funds in and around the transmission system and think about how to ensure that the wheeling charges are appropriate. Funds can be put into the fleet ownership models and the charging business models and so on. And by doing this, not only do we get a larger set of projects to be invested in, but we get to leverage the finance that's out there, put the most concessionary finance where it's needed the most, which might be in the charging system and maybe some upgrades or changes to the roads, for example, and other finance which will help leverage big private investment. So more projects, better leverage of your finance, more finance mobilized. Please do feel free to download the sort of 7 briefs that we've put together and were launched at the COP. There'll be a lot of information about these coming out into the future. And as Alfie mentioned, we're extremely grateful to be able to work with partners, including the Asian Development Bank, as we start to roll out D2D in a number of settings, and at the same time learn collectively with our partners in country, in government, and with the ADB as we go along. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this really comprehensive overview of data to deal. And I think it's really key, this what you mentioned about the whole of government approach, as what tends to happen in many countries and settings within organizations as well is working in silos, right? So trying to find solutions for getting everyone involved and on the same page. I also like this collective learning and co-creation of the methodology and looking into kind of how it can be flexible and adjusted to different country contexts and also create more kind of lessons through its practical implementation. So looking forward to those concrete examples as well, and also testing it within ADB. Let me now hand over before we'll have Q&A at the end of this session. So I'll now hand over to James Dixon for his presentation to dive a bit deeper into data to deal. Thanks. Over to you, James.
Thanks so much, Johanna, and thanks to Michael, thanks to Jamie, thanks to everyone at the ADB for the invite to be here. Very happy to have the opportunity to present. I'm clearly not great at multitasking, so I'm talking and sharing my slides. There we go. Right. So hopefully you can all see this. As Johanna said, I'm going to just take a little bit of a deeper dive into the specifics of data to deal in the transport sector, and have a little look at what we're doing in the future to address the specificities of this sector and what makes it special. So We're going to initially talk about data to deal and concessional finance, and Mark touched on why indeed we're doing this. It's to line up applications to climate finance. And I think one thing that we always want to be understanding us as academics is how do we use these tools and these advanced data methodologies to make this work for the real world, if you'll pardon that phrase. So very much setting the objectives on that. I'll then talk briefly around data deal used to develop transport pathways in a couple of real world examples. And then I'll talk about a few future directions going on within this space, including the Transport Data Commons, what we're doing in the CCG program, including our latest modeling efforts, and then finally, what's in it for you. So there are several training opportunities out there so that you can learn the basics of data to deal from the comfort of your own home, naturally. So first off, eyes on the prize. I think so. The contents on this slide were taken from Agnes from the ADB Institute, who I met in Tokyo this year. And I thought this was quite inspiring because if you look at the guidance from the GTF, there are 3 points essentially that make a project eligible for the acquisition of concessional financing. Firstly, that the proposal must be country aligned, so it must be aligned with the activities of the host country prioritized, including its NDC to the Paris Agreement. Secondly, the proposed project must have its potential for greenhouse gas mitigation quantified. And then thirdly, you must demonstrate the additionality of the project, i.e. why concessional financing is needed, and it can't be done with private sector capital. I think number 2, I've put in bold because this is essentially what we're trying to do. And this speaks to why the transport sector is difficult. So transport transitions entail complex links between policy, infrastructure, and behavior change. When we compare transport to, say, the energy supply sector, which can be thought of as rather top-down in its nature, in that things tend to be planned from a central authority. Even in market-led economies, you tend to get some element of central energy system planning. Transport tends to often be quite different. So transport transitions entail things like vehicle fleet evolution. They entail public behavior with regards to public transport. They behave quite deep kind of socioeconomic shifts. And so what this means is that returns on these projects are very uncertain, and the emissions impacts are really hard to measure, and indeed what's the baseline. And transport is a complex system. So I always tell my students that a complicated system has lots of interactions. It could be a nuclear reactor, but the unknowns can always be known with a lot of analysis. But in a complex system, there are your known unknowns, and there are also your unknown unknowns. So transport system analysis is famously difficult. So what are we trying to do with the data to deal process? So Mark talked about the 7 steps to data to deal, and all at the center of this is the analytical workflow of data to deal. And what this is a set of mathematical tools, essentially, that help countries build these robust pathways towards the stated objective. On the left-hand side, we have a few tools made and onset, which are starting to develop demand pathways. Osmosis in the middle is the real sort of engine of the data to deal framework, and Osmosis stands for the open source energy modeling system, and it's really a model generating tool where you can use to generate models that represent transitions in a system, including the energy and transport system. There's ones on the right-hand side, they're quite exciting, relatively recent additions, MinFin and FinPlan, that help countries specifically identify what financial tools are out there and how those transitions can link with the available funding that's there. And I very much welcome discussion on that point in the Q&A. Just a little bit of background on how we think about mitigation in the transport sector. I'm sure this would be familiar to most of you, but just for the avoidance of any non-sector, any non-transport people, essentially. we'll use this framework called the Avoid, Shift, Improve hierarchy, which is used all around the world as a framework for interventions in sustainable transport, where avoid is the thing you want to do most, which is reducing demand for transport. Shifting is the things you then move on to, which is moving demand to lower energy modes, for example, public transport, cycling and walking. And then finally, improving is how you would improve the end use efficiency of a technology. So an electric car is 3 or 4 times more efficient than a petrol car, a gasoline car. So that represents an improved hierarchy. And what we can do relatively easily with data deal models at present is start to simulate the impact of these different policies and targets on the overall energy and emissions footprint of a country. So for some, excuse me, for some concrete examples now, firstly is the Costa Rica D2D study. So this is one of the really nice because it has a set of really excellent policy briefs, some interactive web-based content, and then it's also backed up by this academic paper. So Godinez Zamora et al. 2020, the links at the bottom, describes how this is done in detail. And the really fantastic thing is that the documentation is all there, which essentially improves the sort of the trustworthiness of this analysis. So in this Costa Rica data deal study, essentially this is presenting modeled scenarios based on co-design narratives describing possible futures of the transport and the energy system. And it is using the scenarios for informed policy dialogue as a building block for designing a long-term strategy. A key objective of this model is to quantify transformations over time in physical terms. So essentially, it's all going back to this target of a certain reduction of emissions, and that's framing in terms of the country's commitment to the Paris Agreement. That's what everything is based on, and then essentially the model is looking at what are the different ways you can use to get there, and what is the way that makes most sense for that country. So this may be the cheapest in terms of capital outlay. This may be the one that's most aligned with other commitments in terms of, say, accessibility to key opportunities, education, jobs, healthcare, and so forth. But as I said, the key part of this is that open models, open data, essentially the openness and the transparency of everything is leading to enhanced credibility of this work. And this is what led this to be so successful. So another great reading point at the bottom, these look like hyperlinks, but I suppose you can't click them, which I apologize for any of that frustration, but this is by Marcela Jaramillo. Excuse the pronunciation of that name, my Spanish is not good, but she led the publication of how this worked in practice, which is a really fascinating read, and I essentially just have liberated a few of the diagrams from that brief. What we're seeing on the top left is essentially the outputs of a model. So for non-technical folk in the room, this is basically energy flows required to meet demand at a certain hour of day across different scenarios for the whole energy system. And a lot of that energy is obviously for transport. And that modeling was used to inform strategies that went into the country's national decarbonization plan, which was essentially a set of targets, policy measures launched by the government of Costa Rica to decarbonize the country by 2050. And so this was led by, the important part to mention is that this was led by an in-country team working with the University of Costa Rica, an academic who now works on the CCG program called Professor Jairo Quiros Tortos. And it's that kind of that concentrating of ideas between universities and local government that really works well. And what we then got out of these are all these robust strategies form these enabling environments to enable this use of these financial sources. So in Marcela's report, I've taken this table, which basically lists all the climate finance sources, the kind that they are. So some of them you can see are policy-based loans, some of them are grants, some of them are joint funds. And the total sum of this is $2.4 billion, which came from Mark's slide. So this hopefully shows you and demonstrates the value of doing this approach. Another example closer to home, I say closer to home because I know I'm speaking in Philippines time. Of course, I'm sat in Scotland, but closer to where most of you are, I imagine, is Lao PDR, Southeast Asia. So this is a piece of work which was led by Vignesh Sridharan at Imperial College London, and has also enabled me to talk about his work. So this represents some of the latest thinking in the ADB transport pathway. So Lao PDR has several commitments as part of its NDC. It has unconditional commitments, and then as many countries across the so-called global south, we will have conditional commitments. So commitments that are conditional on receiving climate finance. So these tools can also be a really powerful way of demonstrating the ability to reduce carbon as part of a conditional commitments to unlock those sources of climate finance. So here we have a conditional commitment to achieve 30% electrification for passenger cars and two-wheelers by 2030. So really ambitious target from Lao PDR and the integration of biofuels into the transport mix. And they have a set of supporting policies for those goals. What this looks like in practice is that Lao PDR released its renewable electricity development plan in 2021, which is all around essentially having a target mix and a target total bulk energy generation for the different regions of the country. For those not familiar, Lao PDR is often talked about as the battery of Southeast Asia. So because they have such enormous energy flows between themselves and neighboring countries, including Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. So building extra electricity generation is a really important part of the country's sort of national pathway. What I want to talk about here is that using this plan, the electricity generation was modeled in Osmosis, which, as I say, is this energy modeling tool generator. And then this was used to look at the potential for generating green hydrogen, so for producing hydrogen through a carbon-free means. And then this goes into the Lao PDR National Green Hydrogen Ammonia Roadmap, which was launched in 2025. So this was a really exciting collaboration led on the CCG side by Vignesh Sridharan. And this was also in collaboration with the Asian Development Bank and the Lao PDR national government. So going back to Mark's kind of D2D steps, this is all about securing support from the get-go. Just finally, I wanted to talk about the idea of using ambition levers. So when I say ambition levers, I mean a way of communicating trade-offs between certain actions in different sectors. So what we've been doing as part of the data to deal flow is developing a set of visualization platforms that allow anyone from the general public to a government official to explore if you have an electrification target in transport, how does this match off with a thermal efficiency improvement in your housing stock or a green hydrogen production scheme in meeting the overall carbon emissions requirements. So on that left-hand side, that's the kind of original form of this that was designed for the UK way back when in the early 2010s. As part of the before net zero, as part of the initial decarbonisation targets when they were coming out. What we've done is launch something vaguely similar to that, taking along from the Pathways platform, which is operationalized from Imperial College London, to develop a PathCalc tool, if you will. So PathCalc is essentially part of the data to deal family now, the data deal family of tools. And once these modeling scenarios are run through, PathCalc can basically be used to showcase the effect of different policies, different targets, to communicate with key stakeholders to say, okay, well, if I tweak, if I reform bus services in my capital city, then that's expected to lead to a 10% reduction in car kilometers and a 20% increase in bus kilometers. And if I pair that with some electrification, then I can start to cost that up, and I can start to build these pathways, and I can start to look at trade-offs in different sectors. So if you look at pathcalc.github.io, you'll see the overall tool in all its glory, and this was a specific version for Laos based on the work that I just presented, which, as I said, was led by Vignesh Sridharan. Great, so hopefully that deep dive into what we're doing in transport historically was interesting. I think what I'd like to talk about just in the closing bits of this my contribution is about why transport is special and what are we doing about this in the future. So our work is clearly never done as transport researchers, and why do we need to think about this sector differently, essentially? So this policy brief was released for COP29, which obviously was not the latest COP, but the COP before that. And this asked, how do we apply data deal specifically to the transport sector? So as I've already said, transport is complex, it's multi-stakeholder, it's multi-policy. It's quite difficult to frame in these united sort of pathways. So how can we adapt a wide, broad-ranging tool like data to deal to this hard to abate sector and hard to deal with sector? So I do invite you to scan that QR code if you want to save that on your browsers. You can also, of course, Google the title, Implementing Data Deal in Transport, or do get in touch if you want a copy of this policy brief, which I think is hopefully quite useful in setting out the main ways to address these challenges. One thing that we're doing to help with this is that transport data is historically under collected, it's under shared, and this makes planning for the future practically impossible. I think a quote attributed to Lord Kelvin, who was a famous Glaswegian, I believe, or at least based in Glasgow, was say, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. So this is idea of how do you develop a baseline of the system going forward before you start to talk about potential greenhouse gas mitigation trajectories without having good data. So the TDCI was launched in 2022, and it's really exciting to report how this has grown in size. The ADB has been a founding member of the TDCI, as has CCG, as has GIZ. So it's a really exciting organization representing over 30 international partners. The idea is essentially to produce replication of data gathering activities in transport projects. So let's say consultants working for ATB or any other MDB or perhaps any development partner will be fetching data as part of their project on a regular basis. And this might just be put in PDFs and it might be rotting somewhere on a digital shelf. So how can we archive this stuff to make it available to everyone, to enable monitoring of transport and mobility indicators related to energy and climate? And then how can we use that to plan forwards in terms of projects, policies, and investment pipelines towards meeting SDGs in general? Currently, we're going through a bit of a sprint stage on data upload. So if you see transport-data.org, we've got a really nice, easy to remember URL. You can see all of the activities that are going on there. So we're currently focusing on more than 60 low and middle income country based sources to really snowball the size of the TDC and expanding resources. It was presented the day before yesterday, I believe, on Wednesday in New York at the UN Decade of Sustainable Transport. So TDC is a recognized global initiative for tracking sustainable transport, and we've made it as a contribution here that shares a lot of effort, some of which has been funded, for which we're very grateful from the FCDO via the CCG program. A lot of it has relied on a lot of in-kind support from individuals from these 30 plus organizations for which they weren't paid, for which it just demonstrates the amount of passion and the amount of dedication in the sector. So hopefully we're getting to the point where we have something that's too big to fail. And I'm personally very excited about what this could mean for the future. Just before I close, I just wanted to talk about our ongoing developments in the modeling space as well. So transport D2D clearly is really useful and it really works. We've seen in Costa Rica and Lao PDR that we can use this to model the transport sector as a really important part of the energy system. So we can explore things like what happens if we electrify a bus fleet. So this is really useful for considering bulk energy flows, but there's currently a lack of a link to the spatial aspects of transport and mobility. So what we're doing in CCG, and I would like to give a shout out to Dr. Fatima Afifa, who works with me at University of Strathclyde, who's been leading on the development of this. So please, watch this space because going to be some really important work. I hope that we're developing this model called Osmobility, which essentially is the open source mobility model, which is a modular open source structure to allow this model to work in different levels of data availability and with an amount of transferability within a global region. So if you make one for, say, Rwanda, could you also use it in Uganda, where fundamental, say, vehicle stock characteristics might be relatively similar, or Germany and France for that matter? It's going to be integrated with osmosis and the rest of the D2D. And the crucial thing is that it's linked to the spatial aspects of transport and accessibility, and it's designed to give transport stakeholders a route in. So I just wanted to showcase very high level how it's driven from OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap data, so this could be the data on where toilets and shops and healthcare facilities and really kind of fundamental opportunities that people need to access every day, how these things are are driving a travel demand model driven by the accessibility to opportunities and then socioeconomic and most specific factors, and how these are then this demand for travel is then met by a vehicle stock model, which has been specifically designed for LMIC vehicle markets. So typically in vehicle stock models, it's assumed that vehicles are new when they enter a country, but as you know, for the majority of countries in the global south, that's not the case. So the age at import is a key parameter that countries can, of course, set policies around, right? So I guess in notable countries like Kenya have introduced age limits on the age of the countries age of the vehicles that can arrive in the countries. Many others haven't. So how much of this can be policy or intervention based? So it turns out a lot of it and what we're trying to do with the Osmobility project is start to think about how this can be leverized, if you will. So how can we develop a model that allows a stakeholder to change things like the density of opportunities, walking and cycling infrastructure, frequency of public transport, to various tax breaks and subsidies for vehicles for electric vehicle charging. So this is currently very much under development, and watch this space, but I wanted to use the opportunity to talk about this because I think it's an exciting, evolving part of Data to Deal. And just finally, before I close out, the last slides is just around training opportunities. So one of the projects we were really fortunate to do with ADB last year is the development of a transport decarbonization and Data to Deal module. So this is hosted on Open University, which is as the name implies, it's quite a unique university in the UK that hosts free learning resources. If you do this, you can get a digital badge for things like LinkedIn, so potentially quite interesting. Of course, you can Google the title or you can scan that QR code for this learning resource, which teaches you the basics of how to build transport models in osmosis, and really sets you with kind of core competencies in this sector for anyone who's interested. There's also the energy modeling platform that goes on 4 times every year. That's co-funded by CCG, UNDESA, and the IEA. These happen in Africa, Asia, Europe, and there's a global one as well. So this is a collaborative open source initiative to support energy system modeling and planning, which I believe has pushed through thousands of participants over the years, and a really exciting initiative as well. Apologies, we're going a bit over time, but that's the end of my presentation, and hope that was interesting, and look forward to any questions and directing them to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, and thanks so much for sharing. It's really interesting to see that there is this tool that helps to kind of organize information in a way that is manageable and understandable and relevant for stakeholders for this really complex sector that the transport sector is, and its linkages with the energy supply and energy sector as well. So that's really That's really great. Um, um, we have received a couple of questions to the Q&A. Please do feel free to send your questions in. Maybe we'll start in the meanwhile with a more general question. This tool kind of functions as a basic basis for open dialogue between stakeholders, which is really key. And ownership, again, was mentioned by Mark as really key here. I'm curious, kind of, if you can further elaborate on how this kind of whole methodology will facilitate or ensure ownership, country ownership, which is kind of the crucial part of making things happen in a country, right? So I don't know, Mark, perhaps you want to take this.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we do to try and just rationalize people's effort and make sure that we can be as effective as possible is have a look at the deal end of data to deal. So what is it that is required as you go and make these applications to mobilize funds with, say, the Asian Development Bank or the Green Climate Fund or some of these other funds? And so it's very clear in there that we need to have a whole of government approach quite often. The things that come out, as I said, have to fit with the development vision. They have to be fiscally feasible and financially viable. So now we sort of work backwards and think, well, what is needed in the institutions in government to be able to do that whole of government cost benefit analysis and be able to come up with that? And we'll typically have a look at the components of government that are required to get that out. And that's where we'll focus the capacity building so that we have a whole of government approach and we understand which bits of government need to be operating together to be able to develop those applications. And what we do is, right up front is make it completely clear that it's the case when we're sort of pulling together this high level political buy-in that this has to be driven by government. So on the one hand, there's sort of the demand that's created, and it's clear where this has to be, where capacity has to be built. And on the other, we have these sets of, as James mentioned, the sort of open source training tools and activities in different places where those can be put together. It's the case that if this is not owned by government, you end up with lots of problems. And in the very sort of immediate bit is that a consultant can come in and do the work. But just taking the example that I mentioned earlier on with the transport sector and moving to electrification of vehicles, in the space of 6 months, the gasoline prices can change drastically. And we've seen changes in costs associated with solar panels, just for example. And so, in very short periods of time, analytics and things that were done can become outdated. And the only way you can really mitigate against this, apart from, and we encourage this, is doing a lot of sensitivity analyses, is to make sure that there's some dynamism in the system and government can oversee the updates to these analytics relatively quickly. I think there's a quote that I don't remember properly, but the essence of it is that a plan is one thing, but planning is everything, and so making sure that that's inside a government is something that's really important to us. In the program and with partners around the world. So James mentioned Lao, for example. We try and work with universities to ensure that there are courses and things put in place so that once the training in government is done and government is able to execute this kind of data to deal activity, that it's the case that there are universities available to generate country-specific knowledge to make that work better, but also generate young professionals that can be absorbed into the system as well. Otherwise, you end up with the sort of problem that you're constantly having to kind of retrain government focus. People get promoted up. So ownership is essential. It's one of the things that we do with data to deal. We coach folk in government to go through the process. So we don't actually do the process. We make sure that it's government doing it. We try and do this over a few years. So maybe the first year there's there's a fair amount of maybe hand-holding and co-creation and doing things together. Second, we move back into a kind of coaching role together with others in country. And then in the third, try and platform folk as well. It's really important that there's sort of South-South learning and experience, because it's the case that, you know, things that are picked up in country are going to be unique. There's no sort of cookie cutter thing that can be imposed. We're sort of learning things as we go along. Anyway, bottom line, capacity in country is essential. We have to think about ways of making sure that that's targeted and built up sensibly over time. And it's the case that this has to be done and run by government. Otherwise, we don't mobilize the amount of finance that's sensible, and it doesn't fit necessarily with the whole of government development priorities.
Thanks, Mark. We got a really interesting question, a bit relating to this. When governments change or a new ministry or minister basically takes over a ministry, there tends to be this back and forth in terms of priorities. What kind of are there any built-in safeguards or institutional arrangements for data to deal to mitigate this risk of kind of flip-flopping, as our question from Atik Rehman mentioned? I understand that this engaging with the universities, academia is one way of kind of mitigating this or ensuring that capacities are maintained, but what others could there be?
Yeah, so absolutely. So being able to embed things in universities, really, really important. I mean, and the principles that are being put forward are not things that change with government cycles. The principles are, you know, they're things that carry over. And then in terms of the engagement, when we have engagement with stakeholders, really important to try and make sure that that's sort of properly bipartisan engagement, and it involves folk that will be you know, in situ or, you know, affected by infrastructure is really long lived. It's the case that we have to make sure that we're thinking about those that are going to be impacted and own it into the future. And so one of the efforts, and James pointed to this earlier on, and it comes from something that was done in the British government with that path calc thing, is to try and make it completely clear what the costs and benefits are for different trajectories into the future. And this helps us be able to go across the silos, whether they're political silos or ministerial silos, to understand why the costs and benefits of certain actions are more important than maybe some of the shorter term political waves that are there. And I would say it's really, really important to make sure that this is done well and it's super transparent, because there's a trust that needs to be built up that goes, you know, beyond the change of minister or beyond the change of government and so on. So just emphasis on transparency, communication, and making sure these principles are there. No matter how governments change, at the end of the day, they're going to be answering to an electorate that wants to see their lives improved over time. And if you can demonstrate that there are certain actions that are going to be able to do that, it's the kind of thing that you know, becomes easier for political parties to be able to you know, absorb and take forward as they progress. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I think we have received a very interesting question on the Philippines case in particular, which was already answered by James in written form, but maybe we could discuss this very shortly as well to get to a couple of more questions after that. But this is basically a question on the jeepneys and the informal transport sector in the Philippines, where the creditworthiness of the small-scale operators and often informal operators is quite low, and the banks are reluctant to assume kind of a lending risk for them. How could this data to deal approach kind of facilitate planning for more sustainable financing or manage more sustainable financing for this kind of informal transport sector? There was also a question on private, kind of how to mobilize private financing, perhaps maybe a bit linked to this that we could answer after that. But James, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I'll provide a brief answer and then in comment, I think. Of course, many countries in the world are reliant on informal public transport, and there are across the world varying levels of discourse as to what as the extent to which these forms of transport have historically been ignored, in some cases made illegal, in some cases, hounded off the streets, and then finally, in many places, are starting to gain recognition for the important backbone of the country's transport system that they are. D2D and these tools will provide a pathway based on high level government directions. And then what I believe is that these pathways are useful for kind of a political backbone in order to enable those discussions with certain subsectors of the transport sector, including the informal transport operators. One very important part of D2D is making sure that these things make sense from a political economy point of view. So the CCG program has an entire political economy units. So oftentimes modelers like myself will kind of be lost in our little kind of nerdy maths world making these new tools. And we'll need someone to sit back and say, well, hey, how is that going to work given a specific country system in XYZ? So we're always facing these challenges as to make that more useful. But I think that's a really great question, Basolo, and encourage further sort of engagement with what we're doing because it's always something that we're trying to help with.
Thank you. And I'd like to still get through with one more question, although we are now kind of running out of time. But very briefly, there's a lot of different types of finance. There's climate finance, other types of finance. How to navigate all that funding out there? Perhaps Mark and perhaps also Alfie, you might want to say a couple of words on this.
I think this is really important and it's a tricky question. I think it's our hypothesis that a lot of finance is not mobilized because, there are just so many different funds out there and they have different levels of bureaucracy that you have to go through. There are different levels of concessionality and it's really tricky to understand how those map to what it is that you want to do. So we have this tool that we're putting together with partners called FinTrack. The idea of this is to understand what concessional finance with a sort of climate and most concessional finance is now tied up with climate goals is available. And so what the funds are, how long it takes to get access to those funds, what the funds can be used for. And they're often like in sort of three big buckets. The one is to do with readiness funding or technical assistance to build up capacity in government to be able to do these sorts of analytics. The other is often a sort of policy-based loans where you're developing that enabling environment in step number 6 that we mentioned. And then there's another bucket that's often around project and project finance and so on. So we're trying to put a tool together that helps to demystify this space. In my opinion, this is something that's really important and very grateful to be able to work with the Asian Development Bank and others to put that together. But maybe I'll hand over to Alfie as well for just extra thoughts and information on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Joanna, and thank you for the question. Absolutely. I mean, the variety and diversity of funds out there is complicated, right? It's difficult for anyone who might want to access those funds to know where to start. There's an element of responsibility on funders to ensure coordination. I think tools like Mark has mentioned, FinTrack, is one potential coordination mechanism for funders and donors to coordinate around to make sure that there is this catalogue of clear opportunities for those seeking investment. There are other potential coordination mechanisms as well, but really I do think it's incumbent on donors, on investors, to make sure that their resources are accessible. That's not easy, of course, but I think all effort should be applied. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We are getting more questions, but I think we will have to wrap up the webinar for now. The speakers may be able to answer some of these the couple of questions that we still have left in written form, while I'm closing off. But thank you, first of all, to our speakers for this really, really insightful webinar. I think we could have gone on another hour discussing this topic. It's such a complex one and a relevant one for countries in the region. So thanks very much for this. Thanks to our participants. Thanks for your active participation as well. That's very much appreciated always. And we hope to see you in future webinars as well. Mark, if I can have the slides, I will have a couple of closing remarks on our past webinars and upcoming. Yes. So in this QR code, you can see past webinars recordings. So you can scan this code. There will also be a link in the chat, and you can find all the recordings, including this one, during the upcoming days on that page. So the Green Roads webinars will continue in 2026. The series is currently being developed, or the program is currently being developed for the next year, and more information will be shared in January on the upcoming series. And if I can have the next slide. Here's also the QR code for the ADB Green Roads Toolkit on the ADB website, as mentioned at the start. So this kit is continually evolving. We welcome any suggestions, new tools you may have to include, or practices and feedback on this tool. So please feel free to get in touch regarding this. And also, we'd like you to take a moment to complete our webinar evaluation form, which is on the next slide. You can see the QR code here on the screen. I think it should come into the chat box as well in just a bit. Any feedback, suggestions will significantly help us improve future webinars, so much appreciated as well. So thank you again, Alfie, Mark, James. Thank you, our participants, and look forward to seeing you again next year then. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take
Thank you
care.
very
Have a
much.
good year.
Take care.